is now in the midst of an avalanche. And the collapse of human civilization has begun in earnest. And a great shift was made in this last week from the pace and the level of, let's say, pushback and of tyrannical overstepping of the final boundaries that would activate people to resist, as well as the complete unraveling of the global financial system and the failure of a number of banks, including very large and systemically important banks, which clearly are the beginning stages of the fall of the empire and not the end. And so people didn't really resist much when it came to losing civil freedoms, like being forced into lockdowns and masking and forced injections. Nor did they even resist when they discovered how many people were dying and being disabled and lives destroyed by all of this. But now, when it came to losing their money, now people are rioting in the millions. And just last week, the Prime Minister of France went too far, declaring the loss of 2 years of pension that the French people were depending on, especially those nearing retirement age who were about to lose a massive amount of money and the ability to retire and to make their long-held plans a reality. He couldn't get the vote of the parliament, and so he used extra emergency powers to eliminate that, and the riots in not just Paris but all of France are unprecedented, way beyond anything that happened with the yellow vests. From the video clips that I saw, many police actually were joining the protest, and firemen. The loyalty to the government on the part of those that the government depends on in order to sustain their power is beginning to crack. If you saw some of those clips, you also saw the very extreme brutality of the cops who were pushing back against the protests and causing a lot of unnecessary physical harm. But the protests have continued, and I think may not end until their aim is reached. But I think their aim now is much more than just about the pensions. I think everything else has now finally awakened them to the untrustworthiness of the government and the illegitimacy of the system. And once people have lost trust massively in the so-called authorities and in the media, and once they have recognized that they have been betrayed, I don't think there is any coming back into normality for such nations. But it's not just France. It's spread to many countries, including Israel, where the prime minister again overstepped the line by eliminating judicial review, eliminating the last check on tyrannical power by the executive branch. And so massive, almost Civil War level protests in Israel. And many of the members of the army, from what I read, did not show up for duty and are on strike. So when you begin to have mutiny in the army, then you know that the system is not any longer stable. So the prime minister did have to backstep a little bit, but the tension is not over. And we are seeing this in many countries, especially the Western world, which is losing its capacity to sustain the life of its members, or even the interest in sustaining life. And so this crumbling of the social order and the entire system of social welfare, and of course people have lost trust in the medical establishment, and in basically all of the institutions. And they're pulling their money out of the banks, and they are beginning to take some very extreme measures. And as the contagion of this revolt spreads, we're going to see ever more chaos and extreme countermeasures as those in power do whatever they need to do to try to hold on to it. So we're in the midst of a final phase of not just a collapse, but a tearing apart of the human race, a rupture of a kind that has no precedent in history, but that has been prophesied to happen, and that is now culminating at the same moment that the international tension between the West on one side and Russia, China, Iran, and others of a growing alliance on the other side is reaching kinetic levels of conflict that's spilling out from Ukraine to many other places now. And the likelihood is that that will continue to escalate to the obvious culmination that is being very rapidly approached. And I just saw today that both Russia and the US are now refusing to give any data to the other party about nuclear weapon tests or any other information about the military, which puts the situation in a very precarious way, because if someone launches some missiles that might be a test, but the other side wasn't notified, they could take that easily as a launch and counter-launch a nuclear war that might not even have been intended at the moment. So we're on a hair trigger situation of balance between life and global destruction. So it's a time that should bring sobriety and an awakening to the nature of the situation within the phenomenal plane that will hopefully give rise to more and more of a concern with and a struggle, if necessary, to attain a level of consciousness in which there can be not only wisdom and understanding of the whys and wherefores and the destiny of all of this, but to enable the consciousness to rise out of its limited vehicle and enter into that non-local field awareness of not just the soul, but of the absolute self, and to attain liberation from all of the internal conflicts that are now reflected so graphically in the macrocosmic conflicts, and to bring about healing at the individual level, so that that healing can also have an effect on the morphogenic field and bring healing to the hearts of all of those who are possibly in states of massive anxiety and desperation over the events that are unfolding. And so that's part of the job of Sat Yogis, is to be in such a state of peace, of joy, of recognizing the blessing hidden in what seems to be so catastrophic at an ego level of mortal mind, but which in fact is no trouble or cataclysm at all from the perspective of the infinite self, which is going through a transition from one age to another, and one age of human consciousness, which had reached a very low and decrepit state, must die so that a higher, more beautiful, divine state can be born. And once one understands that, and one understands and feels the immortality of consciousness, then the fear of death and the fear of loss and the fear of the seeming destruction of our world will be recognized as actually a portal to the birth of a new world that will be ever more beautiful and free of the kinds of conflicts that have led to this culmination. And so in this last period where the margin of time is very slim, we need an extremely direct path to liberation. We don't have the luxury of a long, gradual time to sit in ashrams or take pilgrimage walks and try to do things in a very slow and stately way of reading lots of books and consulting teachers and taking courses and doing all of that. There's no time for that. The destruction is happening rapidly and will be instantaneous almost when the final curtain goes down and the ruins of a radioactive planet of death have begun to settle. This must happen now, and it must happen quickly for those who wish to graduate from this level of reality and not have to go through it all again. And so this is the moment to understand the spiritual knowledge that is the heritage of the deepest and most profound sages of our history and take their messages deeply into our heart and metabolize them into the realization of the liberated self. And this can happen very, very quickly for those who are wholehearted in their yearning for liberation. And to have the luxury of having compassion and the ability to emanate the energy of divine love and light into a world that is so dark and so filled with fear.